Yes,
Oh,
you
yep,
did
there it
it for
is.
the audio, and now
Yeah.
here's for the video. All right, so I think we're starting, Jeff. Let me get back to seeing you. Okay. All right. Yay. Thanks, Jeff, for doing this.
Thank you for
So,
having me.
how about you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am a full-time mystic with a part-time calling to and excitement to talk about it and share about it and connect in things. I do some writing and have a little bit of an tiny bit of an internet presence, and have considered myself a mystic and a contemplative for a few years now. And am feeling really excited about where I am, which is a step into, I think non-dualism has become just such a big thing for me in the last 6 months or the last year. And the best way I know to talk about who I am and what I'm thinking about now is around the idea that once my union with everybody and my connection with all the things that are kind of felt like the post-credit scene, like a cool afterthought, like a bonus. And so somewhere inside there was this picture in my brain that like the Jeff that's right here and right now was going to be floating in some big soup, and in that cosmic soup at the end there's going to be a Wendy kind of floating around, and my mom who passed away for 10 years and all that kind of stuff. And so like, where I've been lately is just in love with the idea that the things that make up me might not all be hanging out in the same place at its most sort of basic nature. And that kind of changes everything, I think. And that's sort of where I am right now, I think.
That's really cool. I love the story. Like, thanks for saying I used to think like this and now I think like this. I think that helps contextualize
Yeah.
the process that we're all in. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that some of the deconstruction that I need to do is that where I was really my whole life, and I think certain communities I participated in made it more of a thing for me. But I think that being in love with the process and not feeling like I want everybody to look like me. I like where I am right now is so cool. I'd love to be able to share it with you. And now being in love with the idea of I am an evolving guy. And if Jeff from 2020 could talk to Jeff from 2022, he'd be like, that was not the direction I thought this was going in at all.
Yes.
And like being able to be open and transparent about that. And I guess it'll be hills and valleys of times that are a little more stable and times that are a little more liminal spaces, and just exciting to be in both of them, I guess.
Yeah. Oh gosh, there's so much already that I have all these things I want to talk about. Do you mind talking more about what you mean by deconstruction and what that looks like for you?
Sure. I'm actually rather passionate about that. I'm so pleased that you would ask that. When I was in college, I was a philosophy guy. In my early not my early, but my 20-year-old, my adolescent spiritual experiences were wanting to be very heady about it. I was pursuing an advanced degree in a little like cul-de-sac of the philosophy of religion called religious pluralism. And what I found at this time was that in my brain, I can spiritually do a God who is impersonal as the Taoists would have it, and very personal as the Christians would have it. and who is 1 as the Muslims would have it, and who is 3 as the, like in my brain, I could do all that, but it's such a juggling act that I couldn't get my heart involved in that. And where I was at 20, that was just fine. I'm a very heady person. I don't know if you're an Enneagram, but I'm a 5 to the core of my existence. It's, it's all about brain, and my whole journey has been about getting into my heart a lot more. That was a super long-winded way to say my first introduction to the concept of deconstruction was where it kind of got, I think it started with the postmodernists, and the place you hear it all the time now is oftentimes people coming out of traditional churches, maybe evangelical churches. And it was, and that's kind of how I use the term. I was certainly really deeply impacted and deeply connected to an evangelical church of my own. But one of the things that I hear people talk a lot about is, now I'm in reconstruction, and why would you ever want to deconstruct if you haven't reconstructed? And I understand what people mean by that, but
Yes.
reconstruction is not a term I like to think about, because when I go back to what deconstruction is about, I always thought it was this, but it turns out that there was a completely different role for that. My favorite story that kind of, I think, gets to the point is, I think it was Dear Abby. It was some crazy 70s advice column. There was a woman who talked about how she learned how to make meatloaf from her mom, and she always cut the edges of the meatloaf off.
Yeah.
And she met somebody who didn't cut the edges off, and she said, "You have to cut the edges off." And they said, "No, you don't." And the lady went back to her mom and said, "Why do we cut the edges off of our meatloaf?" And she said, "Well, I had a meatloaf pan that was too small and wouldn't fit if you didn't cut the edges off."
Yes.
And that's deconstruction. That's that discovery of, I always thought I was doing something for this reason, but it turns out I'm doing something for that reason.
Yes.
And for spirituality, that becomes incredibly important, because when I was in certain evangelical communities, I always thought that my views about God were for a certain reason. I was busy engaging in chopping the ends off of the metaphorical meatloaf in my acts of viewing God in a certain way. And when I made that metaphorical phone call to mom to say, "Why are we chopping the ends off of the meatloaf again?" I found out it was not relevant anymore to be chopping it off, because I had a metaphorical meatloaf pan that fit it just fine. So now, now I don't need to be ashamed about my politically liberal leanings, which were kind of something to not be proud of in that church. Now I don't need to be ashamed about thinking that God could have worked through the evolutionary process and stuff, because it was never, as in the same way the lady said, "Well, you have to chop the ends of the meatloaf off," I was told you have to have these sorts of beliefs, and I either had to give up who I was, or I had to sort of accept the whole dish they were serving. So deconstruction, I guess deconstruction in a way is turning it all into a buffet, where I'm gonna pick this and that and the other thing. I don't need to accept the meal as you defined it of spirituality.
Love it. So first of all, could I give you some feedback?
I would love some feedback.
I am assuming you're not a big cook. Are you a big cook? Do you cook?
One, medium size.
Okay. I just want to say, meatloaf is malleable. Meatloaf is, meatloaf's the one you go, and you can make it any size you want. So it's pot roast.
Oh.
Just helping you with your metaphor.
Thank you. That's a much better metaphor. I am deeply appreciative.
Because the meatloaf will fit any pan you put
Yes. It in. Yeah. I knew that. I knew what all those things were, and it was not making the connection. So I appreciate you helping me to remember a way to make that much more sensible. I was going to let it go,
but you said it so many times, and I'm like, he's going to keep telling the story, so he needs to know. And it's funny because meatloaf is a really good picture for part of deconstruction. It's just like, we can make it any shape we want.
Yeah. Right.
And so, but I don't know, there's people who have trouble with what you just said. And so how do you figure out what to choose from the buffet? Like, that's the question.
I think that's a wonderful question. And the thing for me to realize is that somebody has chosen for us. And so the question is do I want some dead white dude from the 1600s to be choosing for me? Or do I want, do I want some pastor in the 50s to be choosing from me? The idea that any of this just got handed down as it is, when you take a deep dive, I pretty soon gets turned up for a facade. So like, at the grossest level, it's about what am I using for to root my scriptures in, so
Yeah.
I love the Bible. I love the canonical Bible. I probably spend more time in the canonical scriptures than anything else. I have no issue or problem with that, but I also have an awareness that there were people that put their pants on one leg at a time that made decisions about that.
Yes.
And so I and in fact, we do it all the time anyways. If the Bible gives us 12, I guess this is maybe a little bit controversial or not, but when I was in the middle of those evangelical places, it was relatively moderate where I was. And the thing I think about a lot now is Jesus flat out had specific words for the divorced people that weren't particularly nice or comforting. And I have no problem with divorce. I have no problem with divorced people. But somehow those places made a home for the divorced people and
Yes.
didn't have them bring shame in there. Jesus had zero words about queer people.
Yes.
And in fact, the epistles give one of the first people to be baptized was in fact somebody who was, in some sense of the word, genderqueer, didn't fit our gender binaries or any of those sorts of things.
Yeah.
And the evangelical church has not been a safe place for people that are queer. So somebody already chose for the evangelicals what they've got. I think the more you fall in love with God and the more time you spend with God and the more time you spend in those scriptures, the more it's really revealed that so much of what their concerns are in any church you can ever go in is arguable, is debatable. Somebody made the decisions, and maybe they made awesome decisions, and maybe they made terrible decisions, but thinking that I'm doing the right Christianity, I'm doing Buddhism as it was supposed to be, I don't accept that that's a really easy area to find. And I don't, I have not been a part of reading any spiritual scriptures that I could say with 100% surety, this is what we're supposed to do in the year 2022, where like the internet exists, where these like social realities existed that didn't even make sense. Was Jesus a socialist? Was he a capitalist? No to all of them, because none of those ideas existed then. So the idea of it's a valid and worthwhile pursuit to want to figure out what Jesus would be in the year 2022. But for us to imagine that embracing any of those kinds of social things is like maybe diluted is not too strong of a term, to sort of assume what somebody else is giving you is the whole picture.
Yes. Humility.
Yeah.
Humility.
Yeah, right. With humility.
Cool. Okay, so on to more defining non-dualism.
Yeah.
You talked about that. What do you mean by that?
Let me tell you a little bit. I think the best way to, all these words are always going to fail, but I think the best way to point at the thing that I've been noticing, really just the last month, this has been a really exciting practice for me. I had this thought about love and who I love. And what came into my head is that sometimes you might be on the computer and there might be 20 things And at the top of a list, you might get the box that says select all. And in my life, the way that I was living dualistically was I was going down that list and I was checking things off one at a time. This is something I'm going to love. This is something I'm going to love. This is not something I'm going to love. And that's not something I'm going to love. And when I started this step into mysticism, I did the box at the top. I'm going to assume as my default that I love everything. And then I'm going to make my way down the list and I'm going to remove a few things that I don't particularly want to love. And that was good. And that was a challenging practice for a while. And all those times I felt like it took a lot of energy to love. What I have been doing the last, I don't know, few months, the practice that has been my favorite practice to do, and it's hardly a practice at all. What if I don't deselect everything? What if everything that is in my heart and in my mind, I'm going to try to love? And I'm not great about it. There's things that will come into my mind when I'm trying to love everything that are hard for me to love. And it's exciting, and from a certain point of view, it can be even kind of entertaining to notice to notice this or that of oh, I'm not really enjoying loving this person who really hurt me. I'm not really enjoying loving that person. I was listening to Ram Dass speak, and he talked about how he put a politician in, I think it was the early 80s, maybe somebody under Reagan. It was this guy, Caspar Weinberger. He put a photo of Caspar Weinberger on his prayer table.
Oh,
and
perfect.
he tells these amazing stories about how he would, every morning he would go in and soulfully greet his guru, and he would soulfully greet Christ, and he would soulfully greet all these guys, and he would like sort of resentfully greet Caspar Weinberger.
Yes.
And that's how I'm sort of experiencing this, like the sort of non-dualistic approach to just trying to love everything, of like resentful, like, all right, I'm there, I'm gonna make myself love this thing. I don't want to. So that's, I think, one way to look at non-dualistic. Probably a lot of people listening to this know the overarching definition, but maybe other people don't, and I certainly don't want to make assumptions about that. So I guess I can start with the idea that, you know, dualism is living in the part of my mind that I'm going to choose this or that. And for a little while, I thought that was going to be entirely useless for me. But when you get to the front of the line at the fast food place, they don't really need me to affirm the cosmic oneness of all of their meals. What they want to know is, do I want the number 5 or do I want the number 7? So there's times in my life that I need to be dualistic in things, but there's a surprising number of times that, in fact, if I embrace the nuance and I find something to affirm or love or invite in all the things that issues that once I would have wanted them in my mind, I would have wanted them to wrestle things out like old WWE. I would have wanted, you know, if I'm wrestling with, should I give that homeless person $1? One guy says, yes, you should. And the other guy says, no, you shouldn't. And those two guys in my mind, I would have wanted them to fight it out. So I could live with the comfort and live without the anxiety of holding both of those possibilities, that there's a level on which giving somebody who asks me for $1 is exactly the right thing to do. And there's a level on which that could go terribly. And living in the non-dualistic embrace of both of those things are a trap, and both of those things are lovely and beautiful. That's kind of what non-dualism means to me, I think, right now.
Cool. So what I'm hearing is it's a practice for you, and you're continuing to practice.
It's a practice, it's a challenge, it's a joy and a frustration. I know that the times that I'm in my lizard brain and the times that I'm feeling lonely and afraid are the times that's going to be the hardest sell for me to live in that non-dualistic mind, because it's, it's so safe and assuring to identify myself as a guy who gives to homeless people. It's so
Right.
safe and assuring to identify myself as a guy who believes that small government is never the answer. It's always so
Mm,
safe and assuring to always think this or that, but it's
yes.
not real. It's like this sort of pre-packaged response that saves me from having to do the hard work of living with the pros and the cons of my life.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
And you said something. I'm not going to ask you, not going to ask you what love is, because that's a hard question, but it's part
Yeah.
of this question. You said a lot, you're trying to love. What is that? What does that look like, feel like? What are you doing when you're trying to love?
Um, it's embodied. It's right here. When I was super rational, I would have, 25-year-old Jeff would be looking way down his nose at 50-year-old Jeff and saying, that doesn't even, your heart is a 2-pound muscle. It squeezes and it moves blood in your body. And, like, go ahead and run with the poetry of it, Jeff, but release this delusion that there's in fact something that is physical about your heart that's the source of love. And 50-year-old Jeff would smile and say, that's all lovely, you beautiful rationalist, but also the place I feel my love coming from is my heart. And I don't really think it's just my social conditioning. I think there is, like, maybe someday we'll have such amazing science that you're going to be able to point a what's it at the physical spot of my heart. And I think that when I'm loving, there's going to be something emanating from there, that we just don't have the right tools to find it. But so the first thing, as I've been playing around with this love idea of love as a practice, the first thing is that it's 100% from my heart. My physical heart, right here in my chest, and experiencing that part of my body as a like a source of that kind of energy. I think that I have been greatly enjoying and really working hard at getting to your meditations, because you are doing a really lovely dance with well, yeah, like, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I don't know where you come down on the
I'd love to
metaphor
hear what
thing.
you say.
But embodied is in a lot of your descriptions of things, and in your meditations there is this is happening in your head, and all this talk about chakras and things like that were stuff that there's still the, like, the 25-year-old guy lives in my head, like all of us. My 12-year-old lives in my head, and my 25-year-old self lives in my head, and sometimes that guy
Yeah.
won't shut up when somebody is telling me, or when I'm telling myself, that I'm going to love from my heart right now. But yeah, I'm trying to be non-dualistic with those guys too. Like, all right, come down, sit at the table. Let's hear from you for a
Yes.
little while, and let you have your say, because maybe it's going to turn out you're 100% right. But what I know right now is that I would never be so foolish as to want to define love. But I know that when I give my body a place that is the source of love, it's a really good start for experiencing that.
Mm, I love that. I'm writing it down. Um, okay. So you open in your body, in your heart, to that experience you call love, and
Yeah.
that's the practice.
Yeah,
And
it
then it
is.
opens a lot or a little, and it's whatever, if it's Casper Weinberger.
Yeah, right. Right. I'll go through my wonderful kids and my beautiful wife, and those guys are easy.
Yeah.
And I think that because I'm challenging myself in this way, it's a little bit like the old challenge of when somebody says, don't think of a purple elephant. Of course, the first thing you thought of is a purple elephant. So in my
Mhm.
brain, I know that my challenge for myself is to try and love everything. And so, like, knowing that challenge is there, that I'm going to really let like whatever comes into my mind and my heart, um, is what I'm going to try and love. Like inevitably, because I've set this challenge for myself, all the things I prefer not to think about are sometimes the very first things that
Yeah.
erupt in my mind. Like, oh, here's my challenge for this day. Is this knucklehead who said something really nasty to me is now in my mind. Am I going to trust enough? And maybe there's something about delusions of grandeur as well, that like in my own brain, if I'm busy playing like the divine judge, then it's really important what I love and what I don't love, because it
Yes.
matters. Like I'm gonna withhold this from you, and that's your punishment. And like, what a silly way to live. And I think I started to allude to this part of the story before, but I'm not sure I really finished this part of the story. Of I used to think it was exhausting to love. What I've discovered is it's exhausting to cherry pick, and I
Yeah.
actually am boundless in my ability to love. And that's just another proof that I'm not just a like middle-aged balding assistant principal, that in fact there's something divine in me, because this limited self couldn't be a source of boundless energy. But when I make this decision to love, it's like, yeah, I've got enough. I had a friend who, when he had his first child, had this really snarky joke about when he was having a kid. He said, I'm worried that it's going to mean less white love for my wife. And he meant it as a sarcastic joke, because of course we all see the foolishness of that. That your heart is always going to expand for whatever you want to love.
Yes.
And so that puts to rest my old delusion that there's a limit on my ability to love. And like again, what the hard part, the energy was expended in clicking the boxes that I wanted to exclude from my love.
Yes. Yes. It's beautiful. I really like these pictures. Thank you.
Thank you.
I like pictures.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna go. I can't help it. I'm gonna go to the mystic. So you identify as mystic and
Yeah.
contemplative, and I'd love to hear how why you use both
Yeah.
words. I'd like to hear anything you want to say about that.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, those are the two broadest labels that seem to make the most sense. 6.5 days of the week. Half a day I like, neither of them seem very good, but usually I trust the Jeff who was there the other 6.5 days a week, and thought those sounded like a good idea. And for they're interrelated but not identical for me. Mystic, my definition is that a mystic is somebody who's really skeptical about boundaries in general being as firm as they appear to be. And so the most obvious place that plays out in most obvious definitions is boundaries between divine and human, or God and spirit. Whatever names you want to run with, that's the obvious place it plays out. But like a secondary sort of thing is the boundaries between a Christian and a Buddhist. Or between an agnostic and a Christian, or an agnostic and an atheist. As a mystic, I am way more comfortable saying, at this minute, the idea of believing in God sounds like a really dumb idea.
Mhm.
And I might think about an hour ago when I didn't feel that way. And based on my experience, I know most likely an hour from now I won't feel that way. But it's as a mystic, it's relatively safe and comfortable for me to be able to name those shadows and name those parts of myself that I would have been super busy projecting on somebody else back when I firmly rooted myself within a like evangelical tradition. I don't want to pick on them. I learned beautiful and amazing things, and have really sort of circled back around to some of the things that I had wanted to release for a while that I learned in my evangelical community. So I when I keep coming back to that, it's just kind of like where I came from.
Yeah.
I don't. It's among other things, it's not even worth the energy of saying that like those are the bad guys. They're certainly not.
Right.
So a mystic for me is somebody who's got a healthy and potentially growing skepticism about boundaries in general. And for me, a contemplative is somebody who is engaged in spiritual practices that might confirm those mystical experiences. So I think if somebody, assuming everybody's experience was like mine, it's hard for me to imagine you could do spiritual practices very long and not become a mystic. I think you would just have to land there, as a result of the things that seem to pop up for most people that I've seen. So maybe there's a little something about contemplative is a little more related to the process, and mystic is a little more related to the worldview that you end up in.
Mhm. Why not?
Yeah, sure. Let's go with that.
Sounds good. That's really awesome. That's really cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
That's really cool. So this Christian Bible, Jesus stuff has come up a couple times. How do you do you consider yourself Christian, and what is Christian?
Oh, I love it. I love that question. I have been actually, there's been so many changes in me that it's just a delight to do this conversation, because a lot of the stuff I've realized that I've been doing lately is kind of my spiritual coming out of I'm not the person I was before. And sometimes it's hard because, I've got friends that, I think my spirituality bleeds into all the things I do, but I've got some people that my status quo is to go out and have a cocktail in the evening. And like 10% of our conversation might be spiritual, but 90% of it might be like nerdy Marvel movies or something.
Fun.
And for those people, it's really hard to find a natural way to say, hey, I kind of think the Matrix had it more right than I ever thought. I'm not entirely sure that was 100% of science fiction anymore. It just doesn't so it's awesome for me to be able to like say this stuff loud and proud as a way of claiming it.
Yes.
And something I haven't had an opportunity to say out loud, that I am glad that you asked this question, because it's fun to be able to say this stuff out loud.
Yeah.
The realization I just recently had is Jesus is an amazing guru within the Hindu tradition. And he, as I do this study, which is very out of community at this point, my deep dives into Hinduism and uh, uh, non-dualistic Hinduism and things like that. My journeys have been very like head knowledge. Like I'm going to do some Googling. I'm going to do some reading of these guys. I'm going to watch YouTube. I haven't had the opportunity yet. I haven't made it work to like participate in spiritual community, which for me always brings a different kind of thing. So, I want to be careful about the ugly appropriative sides of being a cisgendered straight white dude who's going to grab terms from other spiritual traditions. I'm aware that's a danger, and I'm aware there's only one aspect of the research I've done, but with those caveats, the best label I know for where I am now is Jesus is my guru. And things like the Bhagavad Gita are incredibly fascinating reading that I haven't ever spent a meaningful amount of time in, that are really captivating and complement my love of Jesus in really interesting ways. Sometimes I get almost a little bit lonely because Jesus has been on a path with me for so many years, and there's been times recently that it's been kind of sad of like, oh, I kind of got used to like holding Jesus's hand and looking around with him, but there's these moments where I'll like turn a corner and it's like he's hanging out at the picnic table, like having some, I don't know, a sandwich or something. Hi, Jeff. I just been waiting here for you to catch up with me. I'll read something else that'll be like, oh, that gives me this whole new flavor and this whole new layer for understanding the awesome things that Jesus did that I never would have like known before if I hadn't viewed him through this kind of Indian guru-y kind of lens.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So, is it okay to ask again? Are you Christian, and what does that mean?
Oh, I think the word Christian, even before I landed on this guru thing, when people would ask me what a Christian is, my answer would usually be, I love Jesus, but I have a lot of beliefs that some people don't think a Christian should go with. So if somebody says, are you a Christian? I would usually want to say, I love Christ a lot. I believe that Christ had a unique relationship with God the Father. If there's any other defining characteristics for you around the nature of Jesus, I may not be a Christian. So for some people, atonement theology, that like Christ had to die and took the place of some sort of inherited human sin. If that's a defining characteristic, if I have to be a Christian to accept that piece of theology, then the answer is no, I'm not a Christian. If being a Christian is somebody who loves Jesus, then the answer is yes. Emphatically, I am.
We have a lot in common. That's really good.
I feel like we do. I'm not surprised by that.
That's really beautiful. Gorgeous, gorgeous. And then I would really just like to hear a little bit more about, darn it, what you focused on in school. Is words I wrote it down. It's
Religious pluralism.
Yeah. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, it's funny. When I discovered Richard Rohr, he talked about the perennial tradition. And I said, oh, we just wanted to sound smarter in school and call it religious pluralism. But it's coming at, like, I feel like the perennial philosophy comes at it with the heart in an experiential kind of way, and religious pluralism comes at it from a top-down kind of way. But philosophy, one way to carve philosophy up is that one corner of philosophy is the field of epistemology, which is how do we know things. And a lot of the philosophy of religion is a street in the city of epistemology. And there's a house on the street, which is religious pluralism. And religious pluralism is the idea of that when a Christian talks about heaven, there may be common ground with a Buddhist who's speaking about nirvana, or there might not be. So the terminology is a little bit confusing, because religious pluralism on one level is a field. It's a little part of philosophy, but
Yes.
On another level, it's also one of your answers to the question. So within religious pluralism, somebody could be an exclusivist, and they could say that Christ himself, if you're a Christian exclusivist, you could be almost any tradition exclusivist, but Christian's kind of easiest for me to talk about off the cuff. A Christian exclusivist says only the people that are using the name of Christ have any possibility of getting into heaven. A Christian inclusivist is going to say anybody can get to heaven. They're worshiping Christ. They don't know it yet. Sometimes people use the word, there are anonymous Christians in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And a pluralist would take the position that a Christian, like there's nothing inherent in the idea of Christianity that is better or worse than anything else. So talking about Christ as a path is equally valid as talking about Buddha to a path. And a Buddhist is no more an anonymous Christian than I am an anonymous Buddhist, if I'm not recognizing the sacred of either of those. But both are valid paths to take. That was religious pluralism, I guess, in a nutshell.
That's really cool.
Yeah,
and that's a study.
It is. I would not have ended up with a master's in religious pluralism, but I would have ended up with a master's in philosophy, where every single course I took that I had any wiggle room on would have been in that area. So I would have been like sort of an informal specialist. I would not have been my diploma, if I had finished that, would not have said that. And there's actually a whole other story about that. I got about halfway through that life choice of wanting to become a professor. And at that time, with half a smile on my face, I would say, my life plan is to climb into an ivory tower, to lock myself in, and then I'm going to throw the key away. And that's where I'm going to spend my whole existence. And what I ended up doing was becoming a special educator, working with kids with behavioral troubles that were typically years behind what society would want them to be at on all of their educational markers and stuff. So if there's a corner of teaching that was further from my original course, it was
Yes.
where I landed, which was special education. I'm now an administrator. I'm an assistant principal. So as I started to realize that this head journey wasn't doing it for me, that I could think and I could use words to talk about this sort of God, but it wasn't deeply fulfilling, was sort of around the time that I that I shifted course entirely and landed on that really amazing life and delightful, privileged vocation that I've had. It's been amazing, and I think about the life I would have had if I stayed there, and it's hard to imagine it would be half as fulfilling as the life I've landed on.
Yeah. Which leads us to what I want to talk about next, which is like, this is your full-time assistant principal.
Yeah.
So you've got like 2 full-time jobs and a couple part-time jobs going on, and a family.
Yeah, it's the spiritual thing is hard. When I was deconstructing, it was at first incredibly lonely and hard. And there were a few people in my orbit that would talk about contemplative practice, and I wanted to know more about what that meant. And at the time, my life was absolutely a shambles. There's a lot of mental health stuff in my story, and I'm really intense about the idea that the taboo about mental health in our society is absolutely the scourge of our time. Mental health problems to me are not the scourge. The taboo against talking about it is. So I'm really passionate want to be as transparent as I can be about how crappy my life was and about the mental health components. But my life was a hot mess when I deconstructed, and all these mental health issues were popping up around me and in my own life and experience and things. And what I found was that this contemplative stuff was so helpful and was such a beautiful replacement for so many of the things I was mourning and leaving behind as I left the church. And the promise I made to myself is this should be easier. One of the, I had made a shambles of like every aspect of my life, and financial was one of them. And, you would get so close to, somebody would say, this is amazing, this contemplative stuff. And for $49.95, I'll be happy to tell you about my contemplative practices and stuff. And on the morning after my car was repossessed, because my knuckleheaded self wasn't good about paying my bills and things, the idea of spending $50 to get better and to handle all this anxiety and stuff wasn't even on the table for me. And so a lot of my passion about talking about this stuff is a promise of, man, this stuff is so amazing, but it should be easier. The next guy on this path should have a better time about this stuff. And so I'm really, I love my job. I have really my principal job. I do my best to have really firm boundaries with it about these are the hours that you get me. And if you want somebody who's going to work more hours, you'll have to find somebody else who's going to do that, because there's other aspects of my life that are important. And one of them is my spiritual interest, my spiritual vocation. One of the learning curves for me and all that, and one of the things that I wrestle, dance, and play with all the time is the ego stuff that gets involved with that. When I'm passionate and when I'm thinking about somebody who I want to make it easier for the next Jeff, is that because it would authentically make somebody's life better? Or is that because is that really not any different than somebody who's knocking on all the doors and saying, can I tell you about Jesus today? Which is absolutely an ego trip. And so like trying to be honest with myself about where my ego is raising its ugly head, and where am I authentically giving people new options, which is what I want to do, and where am I taking this like evangelistic missionary kind of mindset of it's my job to swoop in and rescue you because I have your solution. That's something I think about a lot. And I today I feel like I should get about a B- if I was to give myself a grade about that. 60-year-old Jeff is probably going to be able to give you a more realistic grade about it, but Jeff in this skin at this moment gives himself an 80% for handling the ego. But I think your original question is, I've got a couple of jobs. Yeah, I do. But it's been so big and healing. One of my in the middle of all this, as I was discovering the contemplative stuff, one of the issues for me that I was thinking about a lot is when I was 10 years old, I wanted to be a writer. And when I was 12 years old, I wanted to be a writer. And when I was 20 years old, I decided to accept somebody's story about. So what a writer does is a writer waits for somebody called an editor to come by. And it's kind of like a king or a queen that you're going to kneel down and they're going to say, I dub you, sir, writer. And your identity as a writer is confirmed by somebody else. So I spent decades of my life waiting for my passion as a writer to get confirmed by somebody else. And when I went through my time of spiritual, um, I, I, I don't want to say awakening because awakening people equate with like enlightenment and stuff. When I went through and I would not make claims to that being what I have. So when I went through my time of discovering contemplative practice and making it a part of my lifestyle, one of the things that spoke into my life is start writing. You don't need somebody to say you're a writer now. Your heart has been telling you you're a writer for your last 50 years. So write and make it available. And if people are into it, awesome. And if people are not, the act of writing is such a beautiful thing. So so I kind of have to, I've got my assistant principal gig, and I've got my spiritual gig, but dear God, it feeds me in so many ways. If I had 0 people listening to my podcast, if I had 0 people reading my blog or my books or any of those kinds of things, the act of creating it is just so lovely and wonderful. I'd be doing it anyways.
Yes. And what does your family life look like?
I have 3 wonderful, lovely children who are adults now. So I guess calling them offspring is better than children. I have a beautiful, lovely wife of 25 and a half years. It's I'm a little bit of a monk. I have something of a monastic lifestyle in the way of things being so contemplative. It's like all this stuff just happened to me at the right time when if I had toddlers running around the house, imagining I'd have an hour a day to meditate, or 30 minutes a day to write, what wouldn't have been in that portion of my life at that time. So the idea that this, it's the right time for me to be doing all that. I have 3 lovely, wonderful kids I love with my heart and soul, and there's ways in which having 20 and 25-year-olds is like the best, because they're off doing their thing, and I think about them and I love them and I worry about them sometimes, but also they don't need me to cut their steak up. I'm not getting them to little league or any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Beautiful. Okay. What is the focus of your podcast?
So my podcast is called Snipe Hunting. And it was, as I've been thinking about all this non-dualistic stuff, I thought about a process called snipe hunting. Snipe hunting, everybody who's ever been a Boy Scout knows about snipe hunting, and certain other people will. But snipe hunting is a really bizarre ritual that's only bizarre when you start to think about it, because it's such a normal part of life. When I was first let in on the whole picture of snipe hunting, I thought snipes were a made-up creature. It turns out there's a real bird called a snipe. I think they live in Florida or somewhere. And that kind of messed the whole thing up for me. But so my introduction to snipe hunting was on the not cruel end. But what a snipe hunt is when somebody goes on their first Boy Scout camp out. So they're 13 or something, and they're away from their parents maybe the first time, and there's all this incredibly primal, like initiatory like energy, because you're with when I did it, it was all men, and I, I think it's lovely that women are a part of it, but it's like that's kind of a different thing that's equally awesome, that there might be girls there. But when I did it, it was all boys. And it would be somebody's first trip, and you would say, this is the best camp out to capture this amazing creature. And not only that, but this is the best time of year to do it. And a snipe is nocturnal. So we're going to take a pillowcase and we're going to go hunt for a snipe. And you take the kid out away from the little home you've made, away from the camp. And of course, it's dark and you're getting into archetypal energy around the outside world, around nature, around mystery and things. And all the members of your pack, one by one, find a reason to return to the camp. And the end game for a snipe hunt is that you leave this poor child alone in the middle of nowhere, realizing he's been had. And nobody thought twice about that. We did that so many times. And Boy Scouts, all like anybody who's been a Boy Scout anywhere, you say snipe hunt and they are exactly cued in. Everybody does it. And it's ridiculous. It's a kind of a terrible thing to do in a lot of ways. And I had this picture in my brain as I grew older. I wanted to write a kind of like a fairy tale sequel. And in my brain, a snipe was like the opposite of how they viewed unicorns in the Middle Ages. Unicorns were this creature that if you believed and were holy and pure, that was the only people the unicorn would approach. And in my brain, I wanted the fairy tale ending of a snipe hunt to be this 13-year-old thinks that he's been manipulated. He's like, you're such an idiot. You got suckered by these people that seemed like they were really cool. You thought they were going to be your pack. And that's the person who the snipe appears to. So that, like, the fact that I used to think a snipe was made up, this kind of worked a little better for it. It turns out there are real snipes. So I have to tweak the story a little bit in my brain. But the central conceit of my podcast, Snipe Hunting, begins with a story about what we actually do, follows up with my little epilogue about the idea that, like, maybe there's a magical creature called the snipe that only comes when you stop believing in it. The only time the snipe ever can appear is when you have released your idea of what a snipe ever was. And what I had this like light bulb moment in my life is, that's a picture of belonging, and that's a picture of belief, and that's a picture of my spiritual journey. So for me, my spiritual journey was much like a 12-year-old who finds himself with his own people for the first time. I was this lonely 30-something who had these kids he didn't know what to do with, who had this life that was different than the life he had planned on. And there were all these lovely, wonderful people who said, hey, come be part of our club. But there was stuff going on in the psyches of them at first, and eventually myself, when I got suckered into taking the new people on our metaphorical snipe hunts. There's things you do to be part of a community that you don't admit to yourself are terrible, but they're terrible. There's prices of admission for being in groups that are really high, and you don't tell yourself how high they are. So there's things you say about God in those places that in your heart, you think that's probably not true. God wouldn't actually, like, if God is love, God wouldn't actually feel this way about this group of human beings. Mm-hmm. And I needed that. I needed to believe in the snipe for a while, and I needed for horrible things to happen in my life, for this group to really, in a lot of ways, kind of betray me. And I needed to reach a place that I completely released my beliefs in this thing. Just as the Boy Scouts gave me a story about a certain creature I was out there looking for, that church community gave me a certain story about a creature that I was supposed to be worshiping. And I had to stop believing in that God before I could actually find the God that actually exists. So snipe hunting is about my spiritual journey and seeing group dynamics, seeing archetypes, seeing deconstruction, all through the lens of the snipe hunt as a kind of like central metaphor.
That is gorgeous.
Thank you.
Talk about poetry.
Thank you so much.
That's really beautifully layered. Wow. So how's it going? How long you've been doing it? How's it
So
feel for you? What's your
yeah,
response?
my most successful areas by the easy way of measuring things is always been to write books. And so at first, snipe hunting was going to be a book. And what I realized is it's this big, messy, strange, amorphous thing that I don't know exactly if it's a book or what in the world it is. And one of the things that is a great way for me to work with my material, and lots of writers like, is to hear our stuff out loud, so to read it out
Yeah.
loud. And so I thought, well, this is going to be my first step, is to just read it out loud. And as I was reading out loud, I was like, I would kind of listen to this if this was a podcast. And that's going to be a really great way for me to like figure out what in the world it is. So right now I've got 3 episodes that are out in the universe, and I've had some lovely response to it. I have the second half of each one. Each one is about an hour long, and the second half of each one is a spiritual practice that has helped me build my kind of non-dualistic understanding of things. So it's like roughly half an hour of story and roughly half an hour of spiritual practice. My youngest, Auden Campbell, works for or has created a musical entity called Watchtower Music. And that's Watchtower as a reference to the old Jimi Hendrix song. A couple of people have asked me if it's affiliated with Jehovah's Witnesses, because they have a kind of known connection with that, and it's not Jehovah's Witness related at all. But my amazing, really gifted daughter Auden has been doing editing and making really gorgeous music to accompany the spiritual practice and to accompany the podcast as well. And I mean, that's just a thrill by itself, to work with my amazing kids in areas that they're gifted in, that I don't have any idea where she got her musical ability. It certainly didn't come from me, but she's doing all this great work. People have been into it. I've gotten some good response. One of the things I've been trying to say on most of the episodes is part of this process for me is to like tame this weird collection of thoughts. So I'm really open for feedback and for suggestions and for hearing about the things that didn't land and hearing about the things that did land. So it's always so cool. One of the things about this whole journey into writing and stuff is when I lived in a world where I was not identifying myself as somebody who was making this kind of content, I felt like, I guess because I had this image that there was some like kingmaker that had gone on and declared all these people as spiritual practitioners, as somebody who's leading a meditation, as a writer. I thought there was some sort of magical process, and I thought, silly little me, I'm not on the in crowd, so these people would never want to hear my feedback for them, God forbid, especially if it's negative. And so I understand when people are hesitant about wanting to send me an email that says, Jeff, I loved your first 10 minutes, but your next 10 minutes, what was going on, dude? Because I'm lost by that, or that was really boring, or, whatever it is. Man, I love that stuff. It's so exciting to know that the work I'm doing meant enough to somebody that they formed an opinion about it. That's great. So it's been a lot of fun. I'm still kind of figuring it all out. I don't like, I didn't enter into it with a ton of expectations. So I'm not number 1 on Apple Podcast. You'd have to hunt around a little bit for snipe hunting. At this point, I've only put it up on one, on Podbean is where I'm living right now, which is one home for podcasts. At some point, it will feel exciting to check out some of the other places people put up. I've got episode 4 recorded. We're just putting the spiritual practice on now. And Auden is doing her amazing work with giving me some music and stuff to go along with it, and editing it and all that kind of stuff.
So Auden is doing music and editing for you, editing your text. God, how great. What a blessing.
Yes, she's great. She's great. It's a blessing on a logistical level, but it's also, you know, there's something awesome about having really firm boundaries about like work life and home life, but there's also something awesome about the medieval kind of idea of like, I'm going to pass on what I do to my children, and this can be a part of who we are and things. So my kids are all in different spots spiritually. They all think I'm weird and give me loving grief about my plans to start a cult is what they think is happening.
I love it.
And which is fine. They like, I know that cults are bad, and they know that I'm not actually starting a cult, but you know, everybody teases me for getting to this stage in my life and becoming something of a hippie granola crunchy type. She's doing this work for me, and she said some really nice, really nice things about some of the stuff in the podcast. And she really had some positive things about wanting to put a poem I wrote recently to music. And so she and I decided that we're going to do, instead of a spiritual practice on one of the upcoming ones, this poem that she's putting to music that's about mystical union is going to be at the conclusion of one of the snipe huntings coming up soon to do something different. So it is a blessing. She's great.
Yeah.
Wow. And I should say that this is the youngest daughter. My middle daughter is an incredibly talented visual artist, and she designed the cover of my most recent book. So getting to work with my kids in this way is just so awesome. And in fact, my third child is my technical person. So 87 times a day, I run into the old guy runs into problems. And first, my eldest will walk me through what to do. And then she'll say, Dad, if you just YouTube this stuff, you'd be able to do it too. So for all the old dinosaurs like myself out there, the Generation Z tells us just go to Google and type in what your problem is, and most of your problems will be solved. We actually don't need a 20-something to solve most of our technical problems.
Yeah, but then we have to interface what we learn on YouTube into the actual world.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Let's just be clear. And for some people, that's like falling off a log, and for others of it's like,
yeah. I have a deeply overthought defense of our generation, Wendy, for all of this stuff. And my defense is that the early days of computers, they were so incredibly persnickety that if you did something stupid, it would take hours to undo them. And so I think people of a certain age have a real caution about playing with computers. And one of the things I notice about the younger generation is they have a reckless abandon, because it's awfully hard in 2022 to go into Microsoft and do something disastrous. But when we were learning computers in 2005, it was incredibly easy to do something disastrous. So I like to think that we're still here we are back to the word deconstructing. We're still deconstructing our relationship with computers and learning to be a little less cautious with them.
Yeah. Also, they grew up actually playing with them.
Yes, correct. Correct. Right.
You know, like, I don't know. I've joked that they like came in genetically wired to just
absolutely.
Do it. They certainly learn, you know, it's just the world they live in.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so your older daughter did the cover of one of your books. So that leads to tell us about your books.
Sure. My books are this is I'm gonna there was an instinct that wanted to put this away because it's so egotistical, but it's also somewhat hilarious. So I'm gonna say this out loud, and I'm gonna own the egotism in all of this. The picture that just came into my head is that someday Jeff Campbell is world famous, and there is somebody who is studying Jeff Campbell. If such a silly thing were ever to take place, my books would be a really interesting picture of my spiritual development across the last 10 years or so. The one of my outliers is one of the books that's dearest to my heart is a book called Discovering the Essence, and that's a book that I worked with a small publisher on. Most of my stuff is self-published, but I worked with a small, delightful publisher on that, and that is a book that is really about how spiritual practice replaced so many of the things of the holes that were left as I was leaving the church. And so it's quite autobiographical, and every chapter has a spiritual practice in it, but it's also a lot of like, this is what it felt like when I woke up and didn't feel like I had a community anymore. And within that same chapter might be a practice that always has brought me a sense of feeling community and connection with people. So it was kind of like the replacement for that. And I wrote that it's quite a few years ago now. It was one of my earlier books, and sometimes I read it and I get a couple cringes because I'm not quite there anymore. And other days I can smile and want to hug the Jeff that wrote that and think, oh, you thought you were there. And someday I'm gonna want to hug this Jeff and say, oh, you thought you were there. Beyond that, most of my books have a little more of they have less of an autobiographical focus, and they have more of a thematic thing. I am very practical, and at least 50% of most of my books is actual descriptions of spiritual practices. I always, when I was reading spiritual practices, it would be in a kind of narrative of like 2 pages, and sometimes I would be that like the author would go on to talk about something else, and you're like, so is this still part of a meta meditation, or are you now thinking about something else? And I format them as numbered directions of the first time you try this practice, step number 1 is to do this. Step number 2 is to do that. And my fear gets to be that people feel like I'm legislating something, because I think it's really important to play and to find what works for you. But doing that numbered, really specific description, I think, is a way to get over that initial insecurity about, am I doing it right? And so I have a book about Lectio Divina and those sorts of reading-based practices. I have a book about breath-based practice, the idea of the ways that we breathe, and the ways in which that's like a naming of God's name is one of my sorts of bread and butter. And so I've got a book of breath techniques, breathing techniques, a number of them. There's a whole lot of Jeff Campbell's that are available on Amazon. I'm not the only one, but one thing to do is to put Jeff Campbell in prayers or Jeff Campbell in breath prayers, and it's pretty easy to find me on Amazon. I also curate a couple things I want to say. I spoke a little bit about how important it is for me that a person have access to my work who is at any place financially. I'm really passionate about wanting to get what I do in the hands of somebody who wants it. And so one thing I have is I have a website that I think right now has about 80 different spiritual practices. My desire was to have a curated place where if you hear about meta meditation, you could find out what it is. If you hear about breath prayers, I could give you one kind of take on that. And so that's one thing to do. But also, if somebody reached out to me either through social media or through the contact form on my website, which is the faithingproject.wordpress.com, in any kind of way, I would be absolutely so honored to share any of my manuscripts with somebody for whom purchasing the books is an obstacle in any way, shape, or form. And if I could just take 2 more minutes to say, when my life was falling apart and my finances were falling apart, somebody might say to me, if you have a need for a scholarship, please let us know. And I would look at my Starbucks coffee that I had, I allowed myself a mocha that week, and I would say, well, I got myself a Frappuccino, so I'm not the person they're talking to. I am such a huge proponent of self-care, and I'm such a huge proponent of I'm not in the middle of your life. So for the love of God, if it's a choice between buying my book and getting that ridiculous overpriced coffee drink, please take care of yourself and reach out to me. And I would much rather send you my manuscript than have you miss out on some opportunity for self-care. So don't choose between me and self-care. Do self-care first, and know that I would like to put in your hands any of the things that I have done rather than you sacrifice that.
Mhm. Gorgeous.
Thank you.
And you also, in my head, you also lead some meditations.
Periodically I do. I haven't done it, I can be scattered. This is what's making my heart sing this week. And I went through a period when we were in the pandemic where I did that a lot, where we were all so desperate for human contact. And so sometimes that's been groups that meet on Zoom. There's a group of about 15 of us that initially met every week to talk about the topics in my Discovering the Essence book, the one about leaving the Evangelical Church. For approximately a year, every week we met and we talked over the different chapters. We did the spiritual practices, but we still connect. Every 2 weeks we get together on Zoom and we do different stuff. We went through a Richard Rohr book. Then we chose another book together to talk about, and we still hang out and stuff. So following any of my social media, like I guess I should be clear about that. I'm not young enough that I've been inspired to look at a lot of different social media. Facebook at this time, which my kids tell me is the old people social media at this point. Facebook is a great way to find me. The Faithing Project, which was my like 3-4 years ago, was my big way of thinking about myself, based on the idea that faith is an abstract concept. How do you actually practice it? One way to practice it is through like meditative forms and stuff. So the Faithing Project is the name of my website. It's the name of my Facebook group. That started to feel like it had lived its life and it had run its course. To the extent that I have a different like conceit, I organize my stuff around. This is also a Facebook group called 3 Flames, 1 Fire. It's related to the idea that my interests are 3 interrelated concepts. It's the concepts of mysticism, the concept of spirituality for the second half of our life, and the concept of the perennial tradition, or religious pluralism, I would have called it back in my grad school days. Those 3 all kind of braid together in a way for me. So there's a Facebook group with that name that somebody could reach out to me as well. Or you can find me on Amazon, and I think there's ways to connect me there.
Awesome. I heard you say one of the 3 flames was like around the religious pluralism. I didn't hear you say deconstruction, which is, I think, a word that you use.
Oh, yeah.
So, but for you, that's tied, maybe.
Yeah,
It's
right.
very, yeah.
Yes.
Interesting, huh?
Yeah, I think that was a Meatloaf moment of, I think, in fact, so I'm so thankful for your very gracious ways of correcting my misspoken words. Yeah, I believe that as I wrote it, spiritual deconstruction, I spent a while thinking that 4 flames was too many to define, and I had to narrow it down to 3. And I think that I did have spiritual deconstruction on the list and not the perennial
I didn't
tradition.
make it.
Yeah. And it's like evolving is so funny. 6 months ago, I thought that or it wasn't 6 months ago, it was a little more than that. But there was a point at which I thought that was 100% of where I was. And the non-dualistic, the Jesus as guru, interest in like the Bhagavad Gita and things like that, all of that was like, yeah, that's like halfway interesting. But that's a path I'm just sort of more interested in right now. The snipe hunting stuff is really a little more in that direction. So it's
Gosh.
lots of exciting stuff to make my
Yeah,
heart sing.
totally. Totally. It's really delicious. You're just in so many delicious dances.
Yes. Thank you.
Um,
That's a wonderful way to put it. I love it.
yeah, yeah, it's really great. So when you were thinking about having this conversation, what were you kind of fantasizing about wanting to talk about that we haven't gotten into?
Wow. Well, you have done such a amazing job. We didn't do really prep work for this, but you asked all the questions that are really near and dear to my heart. Uh I um I'm gonna be like my kids would say, Jeff would say, Dad, you're so awkward. I'm gonna be awkward because there's a few things that are just close to my heart, and I don't know how to like smoothly just
Yeah,
say them. So
yeah, it's a time.
things that if somebody's watching this and starting to feel alone, um I just want to say that, like, what I can speak the most is about that kind of spiritual stuff when you're starting to outgrow a place that has been maybe really healing and wholesome, and it's ready to move on. I just want to name my compassion and my love for being for people in that stage and how hard it is. And I just want to say that that there is something on the other side of that, that I believe for so many people is going to be so much better for where you are now. Maybe where you were was the perfect place for you to be 2 years ago, but please know, as you grow out of places, there's new places to grow into. My particular departure from the evangelical church related a lot to that particular community not being really well equipped to handle people's loss and people's mental health issues, and to answer questions around GLBTQ issues. So I want to say that if you're gay, or if you're queer, or if you're trans, God loves you so much. If you're suffering clinical depression, feel free to kick in the shins the people that think their prayer will always be enough for that. The person who's wearing glasses and telling you you shouldn't take medication, the person who's taking insulin and telling you you shouldn't take psychiatric medication,
Right.
is simply a hypocrite. So please seek out help, seek out support. So much damage is being done by people that are probably well-meaning but are ill-equipped to support mental health issues. Yeah, those are those are the things that are dear to my heart.
That's gorgeous. Thank you.
Yeah,
Mental health is something that almost everyone deals with here and there,
yeah.
everywhere. Life is really challenging, and so is our spiritual consciousness jumps. Um, it's all a lot. Um, so is there anything else? I mean, you've brought up the mental health a few times. Is there anything else you want to share about that, for yourself or for someone else?
Um,
You don't have to.
yeah, there is something that I would love to share, actually. Thanks for giving me that opportunity. When I reflect on my deconstruction, the thing I know now is that my life had suddenly become really scary, the way it had upended itself. And the words that people said to me, they were telling themselves were meant for me. When they would say things like, it's not that bad, or they would say things like, God is going to see you through it if you just pray in this kind of way. Or even things like, God would never give you more than you can handle. One part of those things are said out of a place of somebody wanting to help. But the other part that motivates those kinds of statements that I wish somebody had told me is the people saying those are terrified that there but for the grace of God goes me. And
Yeah.
all of the things they're saying to you at that time are really subtle acts of putting a wall up of either like, boy, Jeff looks like he's miserable, I'm going to fish around and say, it's not really that bad, because what my nervous system needs right now is it needs Jeff to find the bright side so that I don't fear that this could happen to me tomorrow. That's where those really unhealthy things are coming from, for many people who are suffering mental health issues.
Yeah.
Is people just doing self-defense, doing the best they can in the moment, doing the way they've been trained, but the things they're saying are probably not helping you, and that's kind of why.
That is just brilliant. I love that.
Thank you.
That, boy, like let's put up some posters in the walls
Yeah.
with that on it. Not helping us. It's not helping me. Thanks so much.
Right.
Great. Okay. So, all right. Any final words? I think our time is coming to a close.
Yeah.
So
This was so lovely to be here with you today and talk about this wonderful stuff. Thank you so much.
I'm really grateful. You've given me a bunch of names and everything, but how about you get me a listing of like the places that you can be contacted, and the books and the podcast, blah, 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 and I'll put it on the bottom so everybody can just go click, 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 and I don't have to hunt it down.
I will do that. That sounds great. Thank you.
Good. All right. So thank you so much, Jeff. You are just a joy. I'm very grateful for this time. I'm very grateful for this time together, and I really hope that everybody enjoys it half as much as I did, because you're just so lovely to be with.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to spend this time with you and to get to be really moved and get all this growth out of the meditations that you have been doing every week. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. You're very kind. Okay. Okay, we're done. Wow, that was great, and you're awesome.
Thank you. Awesome. You're awesome too.
Thank you. All right. So yeah, so I don't usually say that at the end, but it's good to say it. You know, I usually say it after. Just get me a list of your stuff.
Yeah.
And I'll put it on, and I have like 16 pages of notes, which I always have to try to be just like, Wendy, don't put 16 pages of notes. Because it's like work, and who wants to read it? Let them actually listen to him. So what I'll do is I'll put like a bunch of keywords. And I like to have people be, for Facebook, I like them to be like, oh, I really want to listen to this because I can relate to these words. And then on YouTube, I want them to be able to be searchable with those words. So I will in the next couple days, I'm like doing my best to be off tomorrow. So in the next few days, I'll get you a draft of what's going to happen, and then you'll review it and give me feedback, and then we'll put it online.
That sounds good. And in terms of I will get you all links to all of my stuff. What's the best for you as I'm sharing this? I would think if I share it from your Facebook page, that's a way for me to have that as a place that people can find out about and get to know, to like sort of name your page and stuff like that. From a marketing standpoint, is that the...
Yeah, I'll put it on the playground. I'll put it on the Everyday Modern Mystic group page. And great. Yeah. And if you could use my Wendy A.R. Wolf. I actually have 3 faces. The mirror has 3 faces in my world. So if you could use that name, Warwolf, that'd be great. Wendy A.R.
Sure. Will do.
Because that's the level at which we're speaking. And I knew that we would talk about Mystic. It's going to definitely go on the Mystic board. I'm sure you have I feel like you have a whole lot of stuff you could also speak to the soul leadership. It's something that you've been working, but life is long. We'll see what happens next.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. So would you like to plan another time to chat about how we could collaborate?
I would love that. Absolutely.
Is this a good time, or why don't you get off on your way? You said this now is a good time. So we could just do it online. We could find a time.
Perfect. Let's try and coordinate our schedules online. Thank you so much for all of the great conversation today.
Thank you.
Take good care. I hope you have a good day and have a good day of rest tomorrow.
Yes.